So in England, we've got quite a few nature policies, and one of the most important ones, which was introduced a few years ago, is called Biodiversity Net Gain, or BNG. And it requires any development that's new to secure a minimum of 10% more biodiversity than when the development began. And that's going to be maintained for 30 years. And a BNG metric is used to calculate the before, you take a baseline, and then an after development score. And you improve that 10% by creating habitats via hierarchy. So as much as you can on site, all the way down to I can't do anything on site, so I'm going to offset it elsewhere, maybe not even in your local area. So in principle, that sounds quite good. You're supporting nature and wildlife directly, but that's not actually how it works, because it calculates that 10% using habitats, meaning a new habitat which may support a local species is worth less than, say, a row of native trees that might not. And actually, the local species that habitat supports doesn't feature as part of any of those calculations. And the final little quirk, and there are a few, is that offsetting on non-urban areas can be worth more than offsetting in urban ones. And that's important if you're building within communities. So why does all that matter? Well, if we want to support nature and wildlife, we've got to ensure we build in biodiversity so that we don't just support nature in our cities and towns, but we don't create barriers, in habitat corridors which stop or hinder wildlife crossing them. But most people don't realise that it's a habitat metric without a UK wildlife focus. And even councils don't seem to get that, with some citing BNG as enabling wildlife corridors. Some even mention bat boxes and bird bricks. So why isn't there a wildlife element? Well, the government seems to think that there's not great evidence to show that bat boxes, bird bricks, hedgehog highways, new corridors, lighting spectrums deliver for wildlife, so it's too hard to put it in the metric. But actually that's the same for the habitats in the metric, because they don't have a wildlife association. And if you need to replace like-for-like habitats, how does replacing non-native habitats support BNG? And councils, wildlife campaigners are always pushing for more of these, wildlife solutions, boxes, bricks and highways to be included in developments to help wildlife. And conservation schemes are championed by local groups, the media and even David Attenborough. So are all of them wrong? Because why would they champion something that doesn't work? Well, they do work. And I'll use one example. So the white-clawed crayfish is a UK species that's endangered. And since the introduction of the North American signal crayfish in the 1970s, its numbers, the native numbers, have declined considerably. And that's because the North American signal crayfish is bigger and hungrier. It's outcompeted them for food and habitats, and it carries a disease that the white-clawed crayfish has got no resistance to. And obviously with our numbers of native species down considerably, we've created projects called ARCs, which isolate the species so their numbers can grow and they can be studied and then located, removed and located elsewhere. So if a development has got the potential to deliver a pond as part of a drainage system, which doesn't just isolate the native white-clawed crayfish, but also lasts the lifespan of the development, not just 30 years, surely that's of massive benefit, not just to the crayfish and the broader ecosystem, because they clean the watercourses, but the researchers. Why would planting non-native trees get units in the BNG calculator, but direct species conservation not? And there are loads of other benefits. You'd stimulate ecological investment, like innovation and solutions. We're seeing some of those come forward, but you need a way to, know you're going to get a return if you're producing a solution. There'd be an emphasis on tracking species movement, so we can better support them. We did that with the Great Christian Newt. And you'd be able to support them geographically and strategically, for example, having particular plants that they might eat. And then offsetting schemes would also evolve to do more for wildlife directly, and local wildlife groups could be better supported because they could do some of the monitoring. We'd all have a better connection with nature. So it makes little sense to be in this position where BNG isn't wildlife strategic. And since 2017, we've been lobbying for on-site to support better wildlife, and we produced a document called Building in Biodiversity, which kind of had data and examples of successful on-site strategies. We're updating that document. There's loads more data that's come in, I think perhaps because ecologists have realised we're not supporting wildlife. And if we're serious about reversing the loss of UK biodiversity, we've got to have targeted strategies and good data. And BNG really is the best place to get both of those things. So write to your MP, get them to understand the changes, and perhaps support our efforts to Trial BNG with wildlife elements on sites of fewer than 50 homes, because you're not compromising the whole existing BNG metric strategy, even though I think it's going to end up the way we're describing it in the long term. But we start the work early to work out what species we can support and where, and we do it in existing communities. So we're removing some of those wildlife barriers, and we are not creating as much potential damage if it doesn't work. Well, not doing any damage if I'm honest, but we're not creating the unintended consequences that people might see if it doesn't work on those smaller sites, typically because there will be within existing communities where there isn't a very obvious increase of wildlife and biodiversity. But we can bring it back. So let's put wildlife as part of the BNG metric. It works for us all, including developers. It's win-win, win-win, win-win.